Imagine surviving years of torment, only to face your worst nightmare in a dark alley, alone with the man who once claimed to love you. What happens when the fear you've been living with finally boils over? This is the shocking true crime story of a woman who fought back when her past came crashing down. Stay tuned to find out how she survived the unthinkable and how justice was finally served. This is a story you won't want to miss. The wind howled through the cracked windows of the old apartment. Rain drummed against the glass, echoing in the empty room. The faint hum of a distant siren cut through the storm. Emma stood by the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone. The faint glow of the screen reflected off her tired eyes. She thought she heard a creak. Her body froze, heart pounding in her chest. The apartment had always been quiet. Too quiet. She shook it off, dismissing it as the wind. Her fingers returned to the screen, but her focus was elsewhere. Another creak, louder this time. Her breath caught. She turned slowly toward the sound. The hallway stretched into darkness, a gaping void. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. No response. Her pulse quickened. The door to her bedroom was ajar, swaying slightly. She hadn't left it like that. A chill crawled up her spine. She stepped forward, each movement deliberate, careful. The floorboards groaned under her weight. She reached the doorway and pushed it open. The room was empty. Her reflection stared back at her from the mirror on the far wall. She let out a shaky breath. Then, behind her in the glass, something moved. A shadow. She whipped around. Nothing. The rain intensified, hammering against the window. Her phone buzzed in her hand, and she jumped. The screen lit up with a message, "You can't hide from me." Her blood ran cold. Her ex. The one she'd blocked. The one she hadn't seen in months. The one with the temper. She stared at the message, her hands trembling. Then another text, "I'm closer than you think." Her knees felt weak. She fumbled for the lock on her front door, her fingers shaking. As she reached it, a loud bang erupted behind her. She turned to see the bedroom door slammed shut. A low chuckle echoed from the darkness. The kind she would never forget. The kind she had hoped to never hear again. Emma's throat tightened as she backed away from the door. Her hands groped for the lock, fumbling in panic. The chuckle grew louder, closer. Her heart hammered so loudly she thought it might burst. The apartment was suffocatingly silent now, except for the sound of her own shallow breaths. She turned her gaze toward the living room window. The rain streaked down the glass, distorting the city lights. Escape. Her mind screamed the word, but her body refused to move. Her phone buzzed again in her hand. The screen glowed with another message. "Run." Her breath caught in her throat. The air felt thick, heavy, like a weight pressing down on her chest. A sudden crash shattered the stillness. The sound came from the kitchen. The metallic clang of something hitting the floor reverberated through the apartment. Emma's eyes darted to the source, but the shadows in the kitchen offered no answers. Her legs felt like lead as she forced herself to move. Step by step, she edged toward the living room. Her mind raced with memories of his threats, his promises to never let her go. She could almost feel his hands around her wrists again, his grip bruising, his voice a low snarl in her ear. The apartment door was just a few steps away now. Her fingers closed around the cold metal of the deadbolt, but her body froze as she felt it. Breath. Hot and slow, against the back of her neck. A voice, soft, almost playful, whispered, "Did you miss me?" She screamed and spun around, swinging wildly with her phone. It connected with nothing but air. The hallway was empty, but the laughter lingered, echoing off the walls. Tears blurred her vision as she wrenched the lock open. The door flew wide, slamming against the wall. She ran into the hallway, her bare feet pounding against the cold tile floor. Behind her, she heard his footsteps. Slow, deliberate, unrelenting. "Emma," his voice called out, teasing, almost melodic.
Come back.
We're not done yet. Emma's legs burned as she sprinted down the dimly lit hallway. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the cracked walls. Her breath came in ragged gasps, every inhale scraping her throat like sandpaper. Behind her, his footsteps echoed steadily, never rushing, always closing the distance. She glanced back, her vision swimming with fear. At the far end of the hallway, his silhouette emerged, tall and menacing. The way he walked, calm, unhurried, was more terrifying than if he had run. Her fingers fumbled for her phone as she turned a corner. No signal. She cursed under her breath, the panic rising like bile in her throat. She reached the stairwell and flung the door open, the hinges screeching in protest. The stairwell smelled of mildew and rust, the air damp and suffocating. She descended the steps two at a time, gripping the rail to keep her balance. Each step echoed in the cavernous space, her movement loud and frantic. His footsteps followed, deliberate and heavy. "Emma," he called again, his voice reverberating down the stairwell.
It was closer now.
"You know I hate it when you run." Her heart felt like it would explode as she reached the bottom floor. She pushed through the exit door, stumbling into the alley behind the building. The rain hit her like icy needles, soaking her within seconds. The world outside was eerily quiet except for the storm. The alley was narrow, lined with overflowing dumpsters and scattered debris. She slipped on the wet pavement, her knees hitting the ground hard. Pain shot through her, but she forced herself up, adrenaline numbing the worst of it. A sharp metallic scrape cut through the rain, a knife being drawn from its sheath. She turned her head, her stomach twisting. There he was, standing at the mouth of the alley, his face half hidden in shadow. The blade in his hand gleamed under the flickering streetlight. "You should have stayed inside," he said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. The words were like a slap, jolting her into motion. She bolted deeper into the alley, her bare feet splashing through puddles. The walls seemed to close in around her, the space narrowing with every step. Ahead, a chain-link fence loomed, too high to climb, but she had no choice. Behind her, his footsteps quickened, his breath audible over the pounding rain. "You can't escape me," he growled, his voice finally losing its calm veneer. She reached the fence and gripped it, the metal biting into her hands. Her fingers slipped against the slick surface as she tried to pull herself up. Then she felt it, a hand grabbing her ankle, and the world went silent. Emma kicked wildly, her heel connecting with something solid. A grunt of pain erupted behind her, and the grip on her ankle loosened. She scrambled upward, her hands clawing at the wet, cold metal of the fence. Her palms stung as the jagged edges bit into her skin, but she didn't stop. She pulled herself higher, her body trembling with the effort. The rain made every movement slippery, treacherous. "Get back here," he roared, his voice filled with raw fury. She could hear him right below, his hands slamming against the fence. The sound sent shivers through her spine. She reached the top, the sharp edges tearing into her legs as she swung them over. Her breaths came in short, panicked bursts as she dropped to the ground on the other side. Her knees buckled on impact, sending her sprawling into a puddle. Pain radiated through her legs, but she forced herself to her feet. She stumbled forward, the world a blur of rain, darkness, and terror. Behind her, the sound of metal rattling told her he was climbing too. Her vision darted around desperately, searching for a hiding place and escape. The alley opened into a narrow street, deserted and eerily quiet. She spotted a row of parked cars, their windows streaked with rain. Her feet carried her to the closest one, a beat-up sedan with darkened windows. She crouched behind it, her body trembling, water dripping from her hair and face. Her breaths came shallow and uneven, her chest heaving as she tried to stay silent. The sound of his boots hitting the ground made her freeze. She pressed herself against the car, her hands covering her mouth to stifle her sobs. The rain masked some of the noise, but not enough. "You can't hide, Emma," he taunted, his voice cutting through the storm. "It's just you and me now." She peeked around the edge of the car, her heart thundering in her chest. There he was, the knife gleaming in his hand, his head swiveling as he scanned the street. Her mind raced, calculating her next move. The streets stretched out endlessly in both directions, no open doors, no lit windows. No one to help. She felt trapped, like a mouse in a cage, waiting for the cat to pounce. Then she noticed something, a crowbar lying near a storm drain just a few feet away. Her eyes locked on it, her breath hitching. It was a gamble, but she didn't have a choice. Slowly, silently, she edged toward it, her movements careful and deliberate. The sound of his boots grew louder, closer. She could feel him approaching, the weight of his presence pressing down on her. Her fingers closed around the crowbar, its cold metal a small comfort in her shaking hands. "Found you," his voice growled, just as she stood up and turned to face him. Emma gripped the crowbar tightly, her knuckles white against the cold, wet metal. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stared at him. He stood just a few feet away, the knife glinting in his hand, his eyes wild with anger and something worse, a sick, twisted satisfaction. The storm raged around them, the rain pelting down in relentless sheets. For a moment, everything else seemed to fade. It was just the two of them, locked in a deadly standoff. "You've always been a fighter," he sneered, his voice low and venomous. "But you can't win this, Emma." She didn't reply, her muscles coiled like a spring. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body refused to budge. His lips curled into a cruel smirk as he took a step closer. She raised the crowbar, her hands trembling. "Stay back," she yelled, her voice cracking with a mix of fear and defiance. He laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent chills down her spine. "Or what?" he taunted, his gaze flicking to the makeshift weapon in her hands. "You're going to stop me? You couldn't even stop me before." His words hit her like a slap, stirring memories she had tried to bury. The arguments, the threats, the nights spent crying, too afraid to leave, too trapped to stay. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't going to be his victim. She shifted her weight, her feet steadying on the slick pavement. The storm masked the sound of her rapid breathing as she calculated her move. He lunged, the knife flashing toward her. She swung the crowbar with all her strength, the metal cutting through the air. It connected with a sickening crack, striking his forearm. The knife clattered to the ground, skidding into a puddle. He howled in pain, clutching his arm, his face twisted in rage. Emma didn't wait. She swung again, this time hitting his shoulder, driving him back. The impact sent vibrations up her arms, but she didn't let go. "You," he started, his voice strained, but she cut him off with another swing. This time, he fell, landing hard on the wet pavement. The knife lay a few feet away, glinting in the dim light. Her eyes darted to it, and she stepped toward it, her grip tightening on the crowbar. He groaned, trying to push himself up, his movements slow and unsteady. Emma kicked the knife further away, her heart pounding as she stood over him. For the first time, he looked up at her with something she had never seen before: fear. The power had shifted, and they both knew it. Emma stood over him, the crowbar trembling in her hands. Rain dripped from her face, mixing with tears she didn't realize she was shedding. Her chest heaved with each breath, the adrenaline coursing through her veins like fire. He lay sprawled on the wet pavement, his body twisted in pain. The fear in his eyes flickered, but it didn't stay. It morphed into something darker. Hatred, pure and unfiltered. "You think this is over," he spat, his voice ragged but defiant. His words struck her like ice, but she didn't flinch. Not this time. She planted her foot firmly on his chest, forcing him back down when he tried to sit up. "You don't get to talk anymore," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Her fingers tightened around the crowbar as the weight of the moment bore down on her. This man, this monster, had haunted her life for so long, leaving scars she thought would never heal. Now he was at her mercy. He coughed, a low, bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You're just like me," he sneered, his grin twisted. "Look at you. You've got it in you too." The words burned, but she refused to let them take root. She pressed her foot harder, making him wince. "No," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the rain like a blade. "I'm nothing like you." Her gaze shifted to the knife, still lying in the puddle a few feet away. A part of her, a dark, primal part, screamed at her to end this, to make sure he could never hurt her again. But another part, the part that had fought so hard to escape him, whispered something else. "This isn't who you are." The rain continued to pour, the cold seeping into her bones as she stood frozen in the moment. He saw her hesitation and smirked, his confidence creeping back like a venomous snake. "You don't have it in you," he taunted, his voice laced with mockery. "You never did." Her jaw tightened, her knuckles aching from the force of her grip on the crowbar. She could hear distant sirens now, faint but growing louder. Help was coming. She looked down at him, the man who had once held her life in his hands. He wasn't powerful anymore. He wasn't invincible.
He was
pathetic, broken, and small. She took a step back, her heart racing as the sirens drew closer. Her hand loosened on the crowbar, letting it drop with a dull thud onto the pavement. "You're not worth it," she said quietly, the words heavy with finality. The flashing red and blue lights flooded the alley as the police arrived. Emma raised her hands, trembling but steady, as the officers rushed toward her. Behind her, he groaned, his voice losing its edge. For the first time, she felt free. The flashing lights painted the alley in waves of red and blue, illuminating the rain-slicked pavement. Emma stood motionless, her breath heavy, her arms hanging limply at her sides. The crowbar lay forgotten at her feet, a symbol of her defiance. Officers spilled into the alley, their radios crackling with sharp commands. "Step back, ma'am," one of them said, his voice firm but not unkind. Emma nodded numbly, taking a shaky step away from the man on the ground. He groaned, clutching his injured arm, his expression a mix of pain and seething rage. Two officers descended on him, securing him with handcuffs as he writhed and cursed. "Don't touch me." "She's crazy," he yelled, his voice echoing against the alley walls. One officer pressed him flat against the pavement, ignoring his protests. "Stay down," the officer barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. Another officer approached Emma, his flashlight cutting through the rain. "Are you hurt?" he asked, scanning her for injuries. Emma blinked, trying to process the question. Her body felt foreign, every ache and bruise dulled by the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She started, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I don't think so." Her eyes flicked to the man being hauled to his feet, his face contorted with fury. "Don't let him," she began, her voice trembling. The officer raised a hand to reassure her. "He's not going anywhere," he said firmly. "You're safe now." The words hit her like a tidal wave. Safe. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to believe it. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the ground, the weight of everything finally crashing down on her. The officer crouched beside her, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "It's okay," he said softly. "Take your time." She nodded, tears mixing with the rain on her face. In the background, she could hear her attacker's voice, growing more distant as the officers led him away. "You'll regret this, Emma," he shouted, his words laced with venom. But for the first time, his threats felt hollow, powerless. She sat there in the rain, her body shaking as the reality of her survival began to settle in. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of something new. The storm continued to pour down around them, but it felt different now. It wasn't just the rain, it was the weight lifting from her shoulders. She wasn't trapped anymore. She wasn't afraid of the shadows lurking behind corners. For the first time in what felt like years, Emma felt a glimmer of peace. The officers moved around her, speaking in hushed tones, organizing the scene. She barely noticed them, her mind still reeling from the chaos that had just unfolded. Everything seemed surreal, like she was watching it all from a distance, unable to fully grasp what had just happened. A female officer knelt beside her, her voice soft but firm. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us. We'll get you checked out, make sure you're okay." Emma nodded, the words barely registering. Her legs felt weak, but she allowed the officer to help her to her feet. She swayed for a moment, her body protesting the sudden movement, but the officer's steady grip kept her upright. "I'm fine," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. But she wasn't fine. She wasn't sure if she ever would be. She glanced at the alley one last time. The man who had haunted her for so long was being loaded into a patrol car, his face twisted with anger. He was the same person who had destroyed her peace, chipped away at her sense of self. But now, she had taken control. Her heart still raced, but the terror was gone. She had faced him, and she had survived. The officer guided her toward the waiting patrol car, but Emma hesitated. Will he be charged?" she asked, her voice small. The officer paused, glancing over her shoulder at the suspect now being processed by his colleagues. "He will," she assured her. "We've got enough evidence. He won't be hurting anyone else." Emma nodded, feeling a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty. The ride to the station was quiet, save for the occasional murmurs from the officers. She didn't speak much, her mind too consumed with the events of the night. But as the car pulled into the station, the weight of what had happened began to sink in. She had been saved. But she had also saved herself. And that realization, more than anything, was the first step toward healing. When the car stopped, the officers escorted her inside, where a room filled with warm light and calm voices awaited her. She was safe. And as the door to that room closed behind her, Emma took a deep breath, ready to start over. The room inside the station was stark, a soft fluorescent glow casting shadows on the walls. But the warmth of it seemed to offer her a small kind of comfort. The officer who had been by her side throughout the scene guided her to a seat. "Just a moment, we're going to have someone come in to check on you," he said, his voice calm, professional. Emma nodded, though her mind remained miles away. Her hands were still trembling, her palms slick with cold sweat. The events of the night were too fresh, too raw. But something deep inside her was beginning to shift. The tension in her body was slowly unwinding, though she still felt a tight knot in her chest. "Do you want some water?" the officer asked gently, noticing her hands. "Please," Emma whispered, her throat dry. The officer turned to get her a glass, leaving her alone with her thoughts. It wasn't until he returned with the water that Emma felt the weight of her situation settle in. Her attacker, her ex, was in custody, but that didn't feel like enough. She had no idea what the future would hold, what scars would linger, what memories would fade or remain. The officer placed the water in front of her, and she took a long sip, trying to ground herself in the present. The door opened, and a different officer entered, his expression warm and reassuring. "Hey, Emma," he greeted, giving her a nod. "I'm Officer Hayes. I'm here to take your statement. You okay to talk?" Emma hesitated for a moment, the memory of the chaos still lingering in her mind. But she met his gaze, and something inside her shifted. She nodded, the knot in her chest tightening but not breaking. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steadier than it had been in hours. As the officer sat across from her and started asking questions, she found herself answering, telling her story piece by piece. The pain in her voice wasn't as sharp as it had been, and she found that her words weren't as heavy as she'd expected. The more she spoke, the more she realized that she had taken control of her life, of this moment. By the time she finished recounting everything, the stalking, the threats, the night that had brought her to this point, she felt exhausted. But there was also something else. A quiet strength that had been buried deep inside her for so long, now beginning to rise to the surface. Officer Hayes gave her a kind smile after she finished. "Thank you for your patience, Emma. You've done the right thing tonight. We'll make sure you're safe moving forward." She managed a small, grateful smile. I just want it to be over," she said softly. It wasn't over, not completely. But it was the beginning of something new. A chapter that didn't involve him. And in that moment, Emma knew she could take the next step, no matter how small, toward reclaiming her life. The road ahead would be difficult, but she was no longer alone. And that made all the difference. The hours passed slowly, each moment dragging as she sat in the sterile room, surrounded by the sounds of distant voices and the occasional shuffle of footsteps outside the door. But in the silence of the room, Emma began to piece together the fragments of her life, the pieces she'd been holding together just to survive. Her heart was still racing, the adrenaline fading and leaving behind a weariness that seeped into her bones. But with it, there was something else, a quiet, unspoken resolve. When Officer Hayes returned after speaking to a colleague, he sat down across from her again, his expression unreadable but kind. "Emma," he began, his tone softer now, "I know this is a lot to take in. And we'll do everything we can to make sure you're safe, but we need to know if you want to press charges." Her heart skipped a beat at the question. The choice felt heavy, and the weight of it was more than she expected. Pressing charges meant acknowledging the depth of everything that had happened, forcing her to relive each awful detail. But it also meant taking back control, something she had been desperately craving for so long. I want to," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she steadied herself. "He has to be held accountable." "Are you sure?" Hayes asked gently, his voice full of understanding. "You don't have to make a decision now. But if you do, it's one step toward making sure this never happens again." The room felt smaller as the words settled in the air. Emma inhaled deeply, her hands still shaking but with a new strength inside them. "I'm sure," she said, her voice clearer now. "I'm ready." The officer nodded, his expression solemn but approving. "We'll get the process started, and we'll make sure you're protected. You've done the right thing." After the paperwork was completed and the necessary steps were taken, they let her go, at least for the night. The storm had passed, but the storm within her was far from over. Emma stood up, her legs unsteady but determined. Officer Hayes escorted her out of the room and through the quiet hallways of the station, the soft murmur of voices the only sound that filled the air. As they reached the exit, Emma stepped outside into the cool, quiet night, the faint glow of streetlights illuminating the path ahead. The world seemed different now, as if she were seeing it through a new lens, a lens she hadn't used in so long. Her hands trembled, but it wasn't fear this time. It was something else. She had survived. And now, for the first time, she could see a future that didn't involve him. The officer handed her a business card, detailing the steps she could take to ensure her safety, and his voice was warm as he spoke one last time. "We'll be in touch, Emma. You're not alone in this." She nodded, a small but genuine smile tugging at her lips. For the first time in a long time, she believed him. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she had taken the first step. And that was enough for now. As she walked away from the police station, the cool night air filled her lungs, clearing the remnants of the suffocating tension that had clouded her mind for so long. The streets, still slick from the rain, glistened under the streetlights, their quiet emptiness offering a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. With each step, the weight of her past seemed to lift, ever so slightly, as if she were shedding layers of fear, pain, and uncertainty. She had fought, and she had won. But as the distance between her and the station grew, something gnawed at her. The silence around her felt too still, too quiet. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the stillness like a shot in the dark. Emma froze, heart leaping into her throat as she fumbled to pull it out. Her hands were still shaking, but she forced herself to focus on the screen. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize. "You think you've won? You've only delayed the inevitable. I'll find you. You can't escape me." Her heart slammed in her chest, the message a chilling reminder that even though he was behind bars, the fear he had instilled in her hadn't disappeared. Her fingers hovered over the phone, unsure whether to respond, to let him know that she had taken control. But she didn't need to respond. With a deep, steadying breath, Emma deleted the message and blocked the number. She couldn't let him have any more of her. Not now. Not ever. The wind picked up as she continued her walk, her pace quickening with each step. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stand still. The night felt endless, stretching out before her like a dark road with no end in sight. And yet, for the first time in what felt like forever, Emma didn't feel trapped. She was free. With the weight of her past slowly lifting, she looked ahead, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that she had the strength to fight back. She had survived. And that alone gave her the power to keep moving forward, one step at a time. The road ahead was hers to choose. Weeks passed since the night at the police station. Emma found herself in a routine, one that felt like both a burden and a small triumph. Her body had healed from the physical bruises, but the emotional scars were harder to erase. She had taken the necessary steps, changing her phone number, installing locks, speaking to the authorities whenever she felt a shiver of doubt. But the echoes of her past still haunted her, creeping into her thoughts when she least expected it. Every door that slammed shut, every unfamiliar shadow in her peripheral vision, every distant sound that seemed to draw nearer, all of it set her heart racing. But she was still standing, and she wasn't going to let fear take hold of her again. One evening, Emma sat on the couch, her fingers tracing the rim of a coffee cup, staring out the window at the quiet street outside. The world beyond her apartment felt peaceful, but there was still a sense of unease she couldn't shake. The phone buzzed on the table in front of her, breaking the silence. Her stomach dropped as she picked it up, but this time, it wasn't an unfamiliar number. It was an email notification, one from the police. Her fingers shook as she clicked on it, reading the brief message. "We have an update regarding your case. The trial is set to begin in 2 weeks. Your presence is required to testify. Please contact us as soon as possible for further instructions." Emma's breath caught in her throat. The trial. It was coming. She stared at the screen, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to hide, to block it all out. But deep down, she knew she couldn't do that anymore. She had to face him, face the truth of everything that had happened. The man who had tried to destroy her life was going to stand in front of a judge. And she was going to make sure he never hurt anyone again. With a deep breath, Emma stood up, her legs steady despite the weight of the moment. She wasn't the same person she had been when this all started. She was stronger now, and she would face the trial, not as a victim, but as a survivor. The past might have shaped her, but it no longer defined her. The future, with all its uncertainty, was hers to claim. The days leading up to the trial were a blur, endless preparations, meetings with attorneys, and the haunting realization that she would have to face him again. But this time, Emma felt different, stronger, more certain of herself than she had ever been. She wasn't the scared girl who had once been trapped in his world of lies and threats. She was someone else now. The trial began on a chilly morning, the courtroom filled with the hum of voices, the shuffling of papers, the occasional rattle of a chair. Emma sat in the witness stand, her heart pounding in her chest, but she didn't look away. She didn't flinch. Her lawyer stood beside her, guiding her through the process, his questions gentle but direct. As she spoke, recounting the horrors she had lived through, her voice never wavered. She knew the truth had power. The truth would set her free. Her ex sat across from her, his eyes cold, his expression one of barely contained rage. But she didn't look at him. Not anymore. She was focused on the words, on making sure everyone in that room knew who he really was. As the days of testimony passed, Emma realized something that made her heart both heavy and light at the same time. This wasn't just about her. This was about every person who had ever been hurt, manipulated, controlled. She was speaking for them. She was taking back what he had stolen from her and everyone else. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the trial came to a close. The jury deliberated, and Emma sat with her hands clasped tightly together, her breath held, waiting for the verdict. When it came, it was swift. Guilty on all counts. The weight that had been on her shoulders for so long began to lift, and a quiet sob escaped her lips. She didn't know if the tears were for the past, for the pain she had endured, or for the relief she felt in that moment. But what she did know was that she was free. He was gone. The control, the fear, the power he had once held over her gone. And in its place was a future, uncertain but full of possibility. Emma stepped out of the courtroom, her head held high. For the first time in years, she walked forward without looking back. She had faced the worst of her past, and now she could finally begin to heal. Her journey wasn't over, but it was hers to navigate. And she was ready.